So we're gonna restart. We have 6 talks now, 15 minutes each.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm presenting this macroeconomic impact of the remote work revolution. It's a joint paper with Petta. The basic idea of this paper is that at the micro level, there are both costs and benefit regarding remote work because we have productivity loss and cost saving. And during the pandemic, there's a huge increase in this remote work, and firms are forced to learn to adopt work from home arrangement. And we find that more attractive remote work condition would raise firm profit and encourage business entry, which rationalize this surprising surge in business application in the US since the pandemic. For the empirical evidence, we studied the relation between business entry, exit size, and wage with remote work, where this omega is a measure of the moving averages of work-from-home rate, where work-from-home rate is defined as the fraction of full-paid workdays at home over full-paid workdays for working-age population. And we computed it for all industries at a quarterly level, where this delta I is the industry fixed effect, delta T is time fixed effect, and we include a set of control variables, and this table shows the result. We find that higher remote work rate is associated with more entry, more exit, higher wage rate, and also smaller entrance size. So given this empirical evidence, we built a stylized model to give us some basic intuition and some mechanism behind. It is a heterogeneous firm model, so workers are homogeneous, and firms can choose a fraction of their workers to conduct remote work. And firms will choose the optimal employment and work from home rate to maximize their value. We introduced 2 features into this profit function. One is the productivity loss associated with remote work, so it's F omega, and the other is G omega, which is the cost saving associated with remote work. In this cost structure, we have 2 components. One is the non-wage labor cost. It is size dependent. The other is per period operational cost, which is size independent. And we assume that both costs are deductible in remote work in the same way. The rest of setup are quite standard. We assume that firm entry, the productivity is fixed. So this would give us a cut-off productivity above which firm would stay in operation. Otherwise, they get this exogenous shock of shutting down and they exit. We also have this free entry condition. Let's move on to some theoretical results. The first one is regarding the optimal work from home rate. So it is saying that if the operational cost is 0, then all firm will choose the same level of optimal work from home rate. Then all heterogeneity is absorbed in employment. However, if this operational cost is positive, then less productive firm will do more work from home. It is because the operational cost would turn out to be a larger fraction of their overall cost, so those less productive firms would tend to increase their work-from-home rate in order to reduce this cost. The other proposition is regarding the change in the remote work condition, and we formally define F tilde and G tilde as the speed of productivity loss and cost saving regarding remote work. And this proposition is saying that when remote work becomes more favorable, whether there's an increase in cost saving or decrease in productivity loss, firm profit would increase and the exit threshold would decrease in a partial equilibrium. It is because intuitively, even if firm choose their previous level of work from home and employment, they would already see an increase in profit because either their F omega increase or their G omega decrease. Given that they can choose optimally again, their profit should increase unambiguously. So it follows the envelope theorem. And this means that even less productive firm can now remain in operation post-pandemic. So this means that the exit threshold should decrease. And this all happens in a partial equilibrium. In a general equilibrium, we could imagine that this increased firm profit would encourage firm entry, which raise labor demand and hence the wage rate. Therefore, in the GE, we would see an increased wage, an increased entry, and also an increased exit. So we introduced several other features into the generalized model in order to better calibrate to the economy. We introduced the AR1 firm level productivity. We introduced capital into production and also the capital adjustment cost. More importantly, we introduced this one-time fixed setup cost, which is a cost that firm has to pay in order to do remote work. And we assume that there exists type heterogeneity in this permanent mean productivity and setup cost. So we first calibrate the pre-pandemic baseline model and then the post-pandemic general equilibrium, given the change in the work from home rate, which would govern the change in F tilde and G tilde, which is the productivity loss and cost saving. So by comparing to general equilibrium, we will see both an increase in cost saving and a decrease in productivity loss. So this more favorable work from home condition would imply both winners and losers. So winners are those low productivity and low setup cost types. So these type of firms, they really enjoy the benefit of doing remote work. Probably they cannot survive pre-pandemic, but they can post-pandemic. And the losers are those high productivity and high setup cost firms. So these type of firms, they cannot afford to pay the setup cost, and they do not directly enjoy the benefit of doing remote work, but they really feel the pain of the increased wage, as predicted in the stylized model. So in this counterfactual economy, we will see a larger fraction of firms doing remote work, and we'll see a larger mass of entrants. However, the distribution is tilted towards the low productivity ones because the losers are getting crowded out. We could see that the last two forces are acting against each other. So to analyze the macroeconomic impact, we conduct two exercises. The first is full adjustment, where we assume there exists no financial constraint or no regulatory constraint to the entrance. And in this economy, we will see an increased output and an increasing welfare. And the other exercise is that we mute the entry response in the sense that we fix the total mass of firms in this economy, and the tilted distribution really outweighed the entry gain, and we'll see a decreasing output and welfare barely changes. So the remaining question is that whether there exists a sustained firm entry in the US. We look into several data sets, both the actual ones and the predicted ones. We could see that the entry is really sustained at a very high level in the US. However, it's not always the case across other countries. For example, Germany actually see a decrease in entry, and while at the right tail, say France, Netherlands, and Sweden, they see even more aggressive entry response. So according to the model, these countries would enjoy a higher welfare gain. And I'll conclude the paper. So in this paper, we study the macroeconomic impact of this huge uptake in remote work. And the paper rationalizes the association between the observed rise in remote work and the entry and firm entry. And it could also lead to an increase in output and welfare, but it depends crucially on the entry response. So for future research, it's going to be interesting to see how remote work interacts with other frictions and how it affects outcomes with two-sided heterogeneity and bargaining between workers and firms. So thank you.
Okay, we have seven minutes for questions.
This is really interesting work, and you had a very compressed period of time to present it. When I listen to you talk, and you have a story for these patterns we've seen in the rise of entry and especially smaller, less productive firms.
Yeah.
One outstanding question that I would encourage you to take up in your sequel, in addition to the ones you suggested, is does this facilitating more entry of small-scale firms have benefits down the road, because that allows for more and less expensive experimentation. And some of these young firms that you only need a few of them that turn out to work out really well, but you can scale them up. And so if that's the way growth and creative destruction happens, there's good times down the road, because we've just scaled up the level of entry tremendously. And as you showed, it's been sustained at a much higher level than before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So more a comment than a question.
So I'll quickly make a comment. Another thing on the model you could get actually is increase. I assume you have the labor supply fixed. You probably have a fixed L. You could find that more people are working. I mean, one of the thoughts is because of the ability to work from home, there are folks that have care responsibilities or have a disability or, I don't know, approaching retirement. You may actually find in this, if you allow L to increase. But, I mean, I agree with Steve. I think it's great. I think it's super interesting. I'd love to see more of the empirics, actually. But on the model, you could get more positive effects if you allow labor supply increases.
Yeah, like L is flexible. We have a first order condition for household.
You could do that. You could say, I had utility from working from home. So if I enjoy
Yeah,
working from
exactly,
home,
like
that'll be
we're
one way to do
fair
it.
game.
I have a labour supply with a utility. I just like working from home, and therefore more people will work if they can work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so really interesting work. I guess, why model it as non-wage benefits changing with work from home? Because my prior would be you change the wage, but the wage in your model is fixed, right? And I think the empirical evidence and the experimental evidence, especially that we know is sort of free of selection bias, is that you can pay lower wages. So why do it on the non-wage benefits? That just struck me as a very strange modeling choice.
Oh yeah, so wage is the equilibrium outcome, and we have that as non-wage labor costs. So it includes those kind of office-based costs, equipment cost, and on-site benefit for workers. So they are kind of size dependent, and decrease in work from home.
But why not just the wage? I just will accept a lower wage to work from home.
Yeah, but like I think the empirical evidence at the individual level is that remote workers, they tend to have higher wages. Like, yeah.
It's the stuff that is contaminated by selection bias. If you look at the experimental evidence that Massim Pillay and David Newmark and his co-authors present, there you see better evidence where they actually are free from the selection. The problem is if you just look in the cross-section, and especially if you're looking in the ACS, you're getting a very contaminated sample.
Oh, I see. Thanks.
Fantastic.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks very much. And next up.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so awesome to come to this conference and see sort of like a mixed audience of people unified around the similar love of hybrid work and remote working and outcomes. You know, it's cool, right? Like to have like economists and people who study psychology. I come from the management organizations department in my school, where I study micro OB. I'm specifically interested in how people's choices related to hybrid work impact others. So for example, thinking about how if I choose to work from home some days as part of a hybrid work arrangement, how my teammates or how my managers are impacted. This study that I'm talking about today looks at the choices that hybrid workers make and how they impact other members of the organization. That is, those that might work amongst them, work for them, work with them, but don't have that choice and flexibility in hybrid work themselves, but they have to work in person due to the nature of their work. Now, we all know what hybrid work is. You know, it's this flexible working arrangement where people can have access and choose to work from both in-person sites, like an office, as well as having access to a remote work site. There's that key trait of hybrid work which distinguishes it from, say, full remote or forced remote work, which is that choice and flexibility. That people have the choice and the ability to work both in person, co-located with others in their organization, as well as distributed remote work. A little gimmicky thing here, but we can think of hybrid work as being this cycling in and out of the office, working both in person and from home. We know quite a few things about hybrid work and how it impacts hybrid workers. And many of you in this room have been the ones generating these insights. We know it reduces commuting times and costs. It can improve work-life balance. It can enhance people's perceived and actual mental and physical health. There can be marginal to slightly positive productivity benefits. And we also know that organizations benefit from having hybrid workers through things like having access to broader talent pools, the ability to sort of eliminate real estate costs, and offer lower pay in exchange for that access to said hybrid work. We know that hybrid workers love having access to hybrid work. You know, it's one thing they prize, and they're willing to leave an organization or take a pay cut to keep access to this resource that they really, really prize. Hybrid workers love hybrid work. But what we don't necessarily know yet as people who study organizations and people who study hybrid work is how the choices that hybrid workers make and how the choice they make in whether to come in person or not, whether and how much to work in person or not, impacts those other people in their organization that might not have that choice and flexibility. You know, I like to think of hybrid workers as this sort of like Newton's cradle of sorts, where the hybrid workers come in, they kind of bounce in and encounter some other workers while they're in the office, creating some downfield effect, and then they kind of bounce back out of the system to go work from home. They impact the people who are part of this system by these movements in and out. But how exactly these fully in-person workers are influenced, those that don't have choice, is unclear. So my research question is thus: how does hybrid working spill over, the choices that hybrid workers make, impact in-person work and in-person workers within an organization? So in this study, it's a qualitative inductive study. I'm looking at a specific organization and how the choices of hybrid workers within said organization impact workers inside this organization that don't have that choice and flexibility. I've mentioned that hybrid workers love having access to hybrid work, and the fact that we have a have-not situation could set up some tension between these two groups of workers. There's been some research that looks at sort of have-nots between, say, fully remote and fully in-person workers, and we know that there can be negative impacts on work satisfaction with one's coworkers. We know that having remote-capable coworkers can decrease the sense of face-to-face interactions and perceived autonomy that people have. And we know that there are sort of turnover effects and things related to choice and where to work based on whether or not people are part of an organization where some and not all have access to certain forms of working. It's important to study this because on one hand, have and have not can just seem like an equity situation. But in addition to it being sort of an equity situation, there is also this fact that as a result of having access to a prized form of working, the workers who don't have this access could feel certain ways about it. They could feel pleased, have a sense of importance, they get to work in person, while others get to work from home sometimes. They could be quite angry at this inequity or lack of balanced access, uniform access. They could be lonely and feel this sense of anonymity while they're remaining in the workplace as the cubicles and workplaces around them are empty. Or they might choose to leave the organization entirely and find a place where other people are working in person largely to support them, to work with them, and to build that sense of community. In the micro-organizational literature, there's a couple opportunities to extend what's already here. The three key pillars that I see myself building upon is this idea of studying how workers' choice and flexibility in working location influences those beyond their direct coworkers. So not just someone who's quite on my team, but also people might be further afield, but I still interact with within my organization. There's an opportunity to explore how workers' use of choice and flexibility impacts those that must work in person, as well as an opportunity because we know that although it's not uniform, that remote workers and hybrid workers are higher income white-collar workers. Often the case is that the workers who have to work in person tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than those that might have access to remote capable work. So there's an opportunity here to do some work where we're studying hybrid remote work, but also speak to the work experiences of lower status workers, blue-collar workers. So I, as I mentioned, engaged in a qualitative inductive study to do this. There's a couple different reasons why someone might choose to do qualitative work. I like it because it's a great way to build theory. It brings people's experiences front and center. And most importantly, because this is sort of a plank of my dissertation, it sets me up then to have this initial model that then I can test quantitatively. So it achieves a couple different ends and is well suited for this research question I have. To develop my angle of inquiry, because qualitative work ultimately isn't just sitting down and interviewing, it's developing a protocol, it's thinking about building theory and iterating from interviews into theory. I went to the literature, and by the literature I mean actually sort of popular press journals, to see what the dialogue playing out about the haves and have-nots was. We see some mixed sort of feelings on it. Some people say that it's failing everyone, that some people are doing this hybrid work experiment. Some people say that remote work is broadly great for diversity and equity. Some people are saying strong stances of, if you don't have access to remote work, you're probably jealous and you're right to be. There's this dialogue going on about the fact that there is disparate access that suggests that people do have both emotional feelings and work-related attitudes about this disparity in access. Of course, sometimes I lurk in Reddit, so kind of like Mark, I do sometimes look at fun, little, anecdotes or, news stories about return to office and things like that. I troll social media and see what people are saying. So, I went there to kind of inform my initial baseline opinion that I then went into explored. Two main micro-organizational theories I'm pulling on as a baseline to inform my research is first equity theory. And equity theory would suggest that access to these work benefits, this hybrid and remote work that's inconsistently extended within an organization could be perceived as something that is a lack of fairness, could lead to compensatory behaviors such of those who don't have access, such as decreased effort, turnover, and conflict, and that if this have and have-nots aligns with other fault lines within the organization, that it could further exacerbate existing conflict and polarization within the organization. So the stakes are real here. Another perspective might be this idea of social support theory, which suggests that others at people's workplaces are key sources of support and energy, as well as stress, and that being present in the workspaces and workplaces of others allows for development of mutual respect and understanding, that it can influence our psychological states, and that if we lack interactions with others, if we're physically isolated from others at work, it does lead to these negative effects, such as negative organizational identification and diminished perceived respect. So getting into what I did is I spoke with workers in facilities of operations department at a large Midwestern public university, what I won't name. I'll let you take some guesses. There's sort of this proud tradition in the micro-OB literature of when we're trying to understand things about meaning, worth, jobs, tasks, and identities, of turning to sort of custodial workers. Jane Dutton, for example, a professor who's now emeritus at Michigan, sort of spearheaded this idea of speaking to lower ranked workers within an organization who hold sort of precarious work or dirty jobs to understand and build theory about jobs, identity, and task crafting. So I, following in this sort of proud tradition, I went out and interviewed many of these people. As a result, qualitative work is not just sort of like writing down what people said, but also engaging in sort of like reflexivity and memoing. So as a result of this interview project, what I have right now, I spoke with 40 workers. I have 50 pages of memos, my reflections. The interview transcripts are extensive. I have 600 pages of single-spaced interview transcripts from these conversations. I have field notes. I met people where they worked, when they worked. So I had interviews at 2 a.m. when people were working and people were working at 7 a.m. I met people where they were. I saw where they worked. I followed them on their experiences. And I wrote about them and took them down. I love this research sample, not just because it speaks to a population that we don't often think about in the remote work conversation, but because it's diverse in other ways. And I've listed a couple of those here that you can just sort of note and take mind of as you think about my sample. So union membership, job type, schedule, tenure, job training, et cetera. These in-person workers in this custodial team aren't just people who might sweep floors and clean up after events, but also people who engage in skilled trades. So we have some electricians, some steam fitters, some plumber fitters. And I learned a lot about the skilled trades through these interviews and the differences between them. But it's not a monolithic workforce. It's both skilled trades for some educated, college-educated workers, as well as some recent immigrants. I speak Spanish, and a couple of interviews were also conducted in Spanish to accommodate some of the custodial workers who speak Spanish as a first language. You might be saying, sounds like a convenience sample. You went and talked to people at some university. But I've already mentioned sort of this proud tradition of doing so, but this sample was particularly salient for a couple of reasons. It's a demographically diverse population. Their short to medium prospects for hybrid work are low, and they work in an organization where many others, such as faculty and other staff, are able to work remotely. Previously had worked amongst them, no longer are. There's limitations that I acknowledge here about the sample. It's no sample is perfect. There's limitations here of this sample. If I had more time, I'd talk about the interview procedure and get into the weeds of qualitative, both procedure, the interview locations, and sort of the coding process I engaged in. If you were a micro-organizational literature person, then you would know that there's a really strong debate about which camp you use to engage in qualitative research. I engage in sort of the lock-grounded theory approaches I built, which basically means I integrated between theory and data to build understandings until I reach a point of theoretical saturation. So for the themes that came out of my data, the 600 pages of interview transcripts, the hours and hours of conversations I had from 40 or so interviews in this first stage, I've outlined here. Ultimately in qualitative work, what we do is build up from people's individual experiences to identify themes that unify the interviews. And I'll explore them just quickly, give quick previews. If I had more time, or if you want to talk to me during dinner, I can share actual quotes that people gave and examples. But I want you to take a look at these themes emerging from the interviews I had. So first, a question, because I'm interested in spillover, might be, did the in-person workers notice that a change was afoot? Did they notice that there had been this rise in hybrid and remote working in their organization? And they did. The way that they noticed varied. It could be from these sort of novel ways, like noticing how much trash they generated, from who had plants in their office or not. Apparently a key proxy for who actually comes to the office or not is if you've got plants, because you have to come water them. As well as things like the number of calls that come in for people asking for cleanup in their building, another proxy. So people were noticing in a variety of different ways that other workers had this choice and flexibility, and importantly, variance in whether they came to work or not. once this variance was noted, once there was this realization that there were different occupancy and attendance patterns, this laid the ground for these in-person workers to engage in what we call task crafting, which is altering the number, scope, and ordering of job tasks. And task crafting is a literature that's been beaten to death in some ways in my field. But what's novel here is that the hybrid workers, in making their choice in whether to come to work or not and when to come to work or not, created new variants and new opportunities for workers to flex their schedules, to engage in different sequencing and tasks, and to engage in more depths of tasks they might not have otherwise had there, say, been unified, predictable level attendance from day to day. And task crafting is important because not only do we like just giving workers autonomy, but it also supports job satisfaction. The more autonomy we have in doing our jobs, generally it can support increased sense of job satisfaction. They engage in task crafting by switching around the orders in which they did work. They engage in task crafting through choosing to avoid situations where they might interrupt someone, supporting the university's mission. It provided them with a chance to avoid encounters or purposely have encounters with staff so they could feel that sense of socialization of importance and worth. I've mentioned how there's this variance in job demands and job intensity based on people's attendance patterns or not. They described it themselves in ways that I think would resonate with us, that hybrid creates this up and down, some more chaoticness. And one of the people they spoke to in Spanish used this word descansar to describe the fact that when people chose to not come in, that they had a chance to relax. So not only did hybrid work create this opportunity to sort of flex schedules and play with tasks, but also created chances for relaxation, to not feel monitored and surveilled all the time at work. If I had a bit more time, I'd talk about some of the dark sides of this as well, which some workers hinted that it didn't necessarily even matter that workers weren't coming into the office anymore because they felt like in the first place it was their job to not be noticed as lower rungs on the occupational ladder, and that in some ways the people not coming to work made them free from having to perform or engage in emotional labor. And I sort of, and it was described ultimately, I flipped past it as no one wants to see us. They want fairy custodians. They want the work done. They don't want to see us. Ultimately, what this allows me to do is build up to this sort of initial model where we take things about traits of hybrid working, of contextual factors about jobs misorganization, building towards things about the process of noticing this spillover hybrid effect and how it impacts both work behaviors and work attitudes. So setting me up for something really promising and further exploring how the choices hybrid workers make impact those that don't even necessarily interact with them on a daily basis through their teamwork tasks, but still occupy the same organization as them, serve them, and notice their presence and absence. And thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, David.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jingyi. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Yale. This is collaborative work with my co-author, Sam, who is on the market this year. So today, we're excited to talk to you about the global market for remote white-collar jobs. So one implication of remote work is that with remote work, not only can you work with domestic workers, you can more easily work with foreign workers across borders. So we take this idea seriously, and we ask 3 questions. First, which countries participate in cross-border remote work, and how does that depend on occupation? Second, we're interested in looking at the wage patterns. In particular, we're interested in how wages in cross-border remote work compare to workers and firms' domestic outside options. Finally, we want to be able to quantify the surplus created by this opportunity to work remotely across borders. So our data set comes from a global resources company. We have over 200,000 workers. These workers are working for over 20,000 firms. The workers are located in almost 200 countries, and the firms are also located across the world. I just want to emphasize that unlike some important work on gig work, our focus here is on longer-term work arrangements. So these are skilled workers. These are our full-time-like jobs. Okay, so let's get started. First, which countries? So on this page, we are graphing the labor demand of a countries for cross-border remote workers against the GDP per capita for that country. So we see a steep gradient, right? We see richer countries are more likely to demand cross-border remote workers. On the right-hand side, we're doing the same graph, but instead we're looking at the labor supply of cross-border remote workers. So the gradient is much flatter. What this is saying is that workers from countries across the income spectrum are supplying workers to work for foreign companies remotely. Okay, so now we want to look at how this depends on occupation. So we choose 3 most representative occupations. The first is customer support. For customer support, the story we're seeing is that the firms are trying to hire workers who are from middle-income countries. So these are workers located in Mexico, Indonesia, India, who maybe have good language abilities. For sales, we see actually is the workers from the high-income countries that really stand out as attractive worker locations. Why is this? We think this is probably because for sales, maybe the workers need to physically interact with the people they're trying to sell to, or maybe cultural affinity is playing an important role for sales. Finally, for software developers, it's really the upper middle income countries that stand out. These are countries like Brazil and Argentina. These workers have great technical backgrounds and maybe live in the slightly lower living cost countries, and they're attractive locations for firms in terms to hire software developers. We also do in the paper a gravity analysis where we show sharing a common language across the 2 countries is very important for occupations where where communication is important. So it's very important for customer support and sales and not as important for software developers. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talking about the wages. So first, we want to ask the question, which is globalization of the labor market creating more equal wages across countries? So on the left-hand side, we're just plotting the wages that workers make in cross-border remote work against their country's GDP per capita, all normalized by US. Okay, so the left-hand side is saying that workers from richer countries are being paid more, even though they all work remotely for foreign firms. Okay, but the slope is not that large, right? It's a 0.19 slope, so it's not like the income disparity really persists. It gets attenuated in remote work. On the right-hand side, we do the same exercise, but compare workers who are employed by the same firms. So we see that workers employed by the same firm are paid, their wage is not predicted that strongly by where they come from. So within the same firm, there's a moderate level of firm-wide wage setting. Okay, so the next question we want to ask is that how the wages compare to the firms and the workers' domestic outside options. So here we are showing you the distribution of the annual wage that Argentine software developers get paid by American firms in our data, right? So software developers is an important occupation for our data set, and this particular pairing, Argentine software developers, American firms, is one of the most popular pairing in our data set. So we see a distribution of wage. Okay, so this is from our data set, and now we're bringing in data from Glassdoor that will tell us information about workers and firms' outside option. Okay, so the orange line over there, it's showing that the median wage that Argentine workers get paid by Argentine firms. The green line is the median wage that American software developers get paid by American wages. So you see the vast majority of the remote wages fall in between these 2 lines. So the Argentine software developers employed by American firms are paid more than they would domestically, but less than what the American firms would pay a domestic worker. Okay, so you may wonder that maybe the workers and firms are selected. Maybe they're not representative from their home countries. So if we do a more conservative exercise where we use the 75th percentile of the wage that Argentine software developers make and the 25th percentile of American wages. So if we assume that the workers are positively selected and the firms are negatively selected, we still show that most of the remote wages are in between the firms and the workers' outside options. Okay, so the final step is to basically take this exercise and to average it across occupations, across workers, and across firms, and get some idea of the surplus. So basically, the surplus would be in between the orange line and the green line and tell us how big is this arbitrage opportunity between countries. Okay. So doing this exercise, we find that the gains of cross-country remote hiring to the worker and firms involved are very large. We bounded in between $32,000 and $109,000 per contract per year. We're able to show how this is divided between workers and firms. So we see that both workers and firms gain substantially, with workers actually gaining more than the firms. Finally, we show that the worker gain at least 70% with this option of working remotely, and the firms save at least 20% because of this ability to hire foreign workers remotely. Okay, so to conclude, today we show you research where we bring to the literature a new data set on 20,000 firms' globally distributed workforce. We have 3 findings. First, we show that workers in countries across the income spectrum have workers working remotely for foreign firms. But the specialization of the countries depends on the worker's occupation. Second, we look at the wages. We show you that the wages that the workers get paid are in between what they would earn domestically and the firm's outside option. We use all of the data to quantify the surplus and show that firms save a lot, save between 20 to 53% when they are able to work remote, when they're able to hire foreign remote workers, while workers expect a large wage gain because of this ability to work remotely for foreign firms. I'm happy to take questions now.
About Enrico Moretti's work about the geography of jobs and how tech workers living in clusters might have higher nominal wages, but relatively lower real wages. Mm-hmm. One analysis you could do is just analyze the real wages controlling for firm fixed effects. And, and you probably will find like really interesting effects.
Right, exactly. We might find workers from poorer countries actually make higher real wages. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. Thank you for the suggestion. Yeah.
Really cool stuff.
Thank you.
2 comments. One, I encourage you to expand your concept of surplus to encompass what goes to the intermediary.
Okay.
Apparently, you've netted that out somehow.
Yeah.
But there's a surplus here. It's being split 3 ways. Mm-hmm. It'd be nice to draw out all 3. More generally, the surplus splitting stuff is really interesting, and I would encourage you to break that down by labor source country, labor demand source country, mm-hmm. type of occupation and job to the extent your data set allows you to do that. That's just super interesting. We rarely get to see kind of, I understand there's selection problems, unobservables and so on, but we rarely get to see such a clean take on the split of what is obviously a newly created surplus by this matching technology.
Totally agree. Yeah, we'll definitely look into those heterogeneity. Yeah.
Can you see changes in wages domestically over time? I don't know if your data allow that.
Yeah, one limitation of the data is we don't see a whole lot of domestic wages because of the particular data company that we work with. But we would love to see that, and to the extent that we could, we should definitely look at the trend over time.
I think it would be interesting to see both the domestic piece and what happens in your example in the Argentine software developers, and see if are we bargaining up where that ends up.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
I have just a quick comment, which is I'm not sure I would show Argentina as the example because it is the one economy where prices are definitely not stable. So how you deflate can matter a lot. And you can't even convert dollars into pesos easily. You have to go on the street with some guy who's underground.
I know, I was there. I worked in Argentina for a summer. Anyway. Yeah, it was very hard to get any US dollar. So yeah, I agree. We'll find another.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure it looks similar for Brazil or Chile or something like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah.
You have a question over here too.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to maybe make a suggestion for you guys to look at what happens to the wages of the worker who is remote in Argentina is brought on to work in Seattle or in San Francisco, because I think that will give you a sense of sort of the margin of adjustment. The other thing you could look into is changes in immigration policy and quota for worker visas for highly skilled labor here in the States, because I think that will change maybe the division of gains and surplus between the firms and the employees.
Great suggestions. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether these firms already have presence in different countries, or whether they, I don't know about your data set, but basically there's a cost of having a location in one place. And then the other question related to that would be that in the second country, would people be coming in person, because it would be cheaper in terms of other costs as well, like rent and everything?
Our particular data set, is a cost for the firms to have a local office, and that's one reason why some of these firms are working with our data provider to not have to go through that bureaucratic process. And I think that process itself is preventing more global remote work from happening. So that's a good question. Regarding whether the workers are going to office, Argentine software developer, are they hanging out with each other? I think they might be. But yeah, it's more about the ability to work remotely with American firms. Yeah. Okay, I'm really looking forward to connecting with you all at dinner. Thank you.
Good afternoon. That's loud. Thanks for having me. This seems like a really great conference. I've learned a lot so far. I am David. I'm sort of so I have a joke about Frankenstein in my first few slides. I'm a sort of a Frankenstein of the people before. I'm a fifth-year PhD student. I'm from University of Michigan, and I also went to University of Oxford, so there we go. And this is joint work with Florian Gonzilius, who's my supervisor now at Emory, and Austin Wright at the Harris School of Public Policy. So we look at, the title says it all, says it's return to office and the tenure distribution. Right, same problem as before. Green button, there we go. This is sort of maybe common knowledge in this room. With the end of COVID-19, this sort of fight over the workplace heated up a lot. And there's a lot of open questions about what the implications of remote work are. What we do is we look at return to office mandates or RTO mandates, just like session before, and we look at what happens to the distribution of employees. Now, why is that important? We're talking about a workforce, right? So we ideally want to consider the entire workforce jointly and not just simply average effects. And in particular, these composition changes to the workforce can really strongly impact both the firm and have important ripple effects in the wider economy. I've just highlighted 2 papers in this conference that talk about those things. The previous presentation also did. So the method we use is the distribution of synthetic controls. So this is a method developed by Florian, sort of ideally suited to this setting. The idea is we construct a sort of Frankenstein workforce, right? So we ideally want to be able to control for how the workforce of a company, as it returns to office, would have behaved if it hadn't returned to office, right? That gives us a causal effect. Synthetic controls is a method that sort of takes a bunch of control units in a setting where you don't have random treatment, and then say, let's try and find some combination of these control units to really best resemble the treated unit. So in our case, we focus on Microsoft, and we construct a sort of Frankenstein Microsoft that we argue would behave like Microsoft would have if it hadn't returned to the office. With that method, we find sort of 2 key results. First, senior and longer tenured employees, after Microsoft and 2 other large tech companies implement the return to office mandate, leave at higher rates. Right, so there's a positive correlation between seniority and how quickly you leave a company after it returns to office. In fact, we find null results for people who are there for a shorter amount of time. And they depart for larger companies than they otherwise would have. So it seems basically the findings are the senior employees are leaving for large competitors. And then we have some null results. We don't really find changes in the gender composition of the company, the return to office mandate company, or we don't find that people who are leaving are settling for worse options in a way. So we don't find evidence for that they have changed their role at the new company or that they accept demotions. All right, so this is sort of similar to some of the things Mark showed you earlier. this is a bit navel-gazing, but so the Washington Post did an article on our paper, and then both Apple and Microsoft came out and said, this research is inaccurate. Just to show you that it seems like we all in this room know that this is an important question, but it seemed like they also thought it was an important question because they found it worthwhile to come out and say it's not. And then with the recent Amazon return to office, Microsoft actually contradicted itself and said, "Oh, we're not going to do a full RTO, but implicitly acknowledge they did have an RTO, unlike what they said in response to our paper." So I might skip the literature in the interest of time. But I highlighted again 2 papers that are closely related. You've seen one of them, so I don't have to cover that one. And then there's some survey evidence that basically replicates or shows our finding, showing that more senior employees are more likely to leave. If they say they would more likely leave, we sort of show that they actually do, right? So that's our key contribution. We take a causal inference approach, so we try to get at causal effects, and we use behavioral data, namely resumes, so we see what's actually happening versus what people say they would do. And then there's, of course, extremely large literature on work from home, which we've learned a lot from, and most of the people in this room are responsible for. And I think maybe key is the paper by Emmanuel et al., which shows that more senior engineers are more productive when they work from home relative to less senior engineers, so that sort of relates to our seniority findings. All right, so with the introduction out of the way, I'll briefly discuss which data we use. So there's 3 sources of data. First, we just have to collect data on RTO mandates. There's some papers before that also did it manually because companies are sort of loath to disclose exactly what they're going to do unless it's a sort of flagship policy, right? So what we do is we focus on the tech sector. We collect RTO dates for the tech sector. And then we supplement the dates for those treated companies, right, that return to the office with a large set of control units that never return to the office, or at least return to the office very late after our sample period. And that comes from the Flex Index, just like Flint's paper. Then our key data is the resume data from People Data Labs. So this is sort of global resume data. I think in the US it contains about 300 million resume or person items, not fully resumes. It comes from a large variety of sources, basically all of LinkedIn, all of Twitter, and think of additional things. You can think of keys that it includes some direct HR data, so it's not just not just online or scraped data. There's some data that comes directly from HR tech, and that leads to a very comprehensive source. So for our key treated firms, we have 30 to 50% of all resumes within that firm. And so the structure of the data is quite simple. It's resume items: start date, end date, position, company, possibly location. From that information, we construct a measure of tenure, which is simply at a given point in time t, how long has person I worked at firm J? And we count this in terms of days, but our time varies at the quarterly level. If there's multiple employment spells in the same company, obviously we just sum it across for one worker, right? So you might have been promoted or something, we count for that. That's our key measure. The other measure we use is this seniority measure. And that's a sort of discrete way to assess the title of an employee. So the lowest is unpaid, then training, and it goes up all the way to the C-suite. Then we collect some data on layoffs, because there were a lot of layoffs in the tech sector, a large wave of them. That might bias our results if these coincide, because it's a separate policy, right? So we don't want to confound those effects. That data comes from layoffs at FYI, which appears to sort of capture almost the universe of layoffs in the sector. And then we construct a sample from these 3 data sources. So what we do is we take treated units that return to the office, and then we ask, we exclude any company that had a layoff in the sample period 2 quarters before and 1 quarter after the return to office. That just leaves 3 treated companies because of the sort of large wave of layoffs: Microsoft, SpaceX, and Apple. the sort of nice thing is that they're very similar. We could argue they're quite similar companies, right? Between both hardware and software, very large companies. And key, they were also early movers in announcing return to office. That means that their layoffs came later. It doesn't really matter for synthetic controls. That's sort of important to note that this is not a representative treated unit, right? Because we look at each unit separately and synthetic controls focuses on internal validity, right? What happens at this company. So in that sense, sort of fine. External validity, I leave up to the audience to extrapolate. And then our control units, as I say, are companies that either never return to the office or return to the office 6 months after our sample period to sort of account for any possible anticipation effects. Here's a simple descriptive figure which shows the network of outflows from Microsoft to other firms. And so the key takeaway here is the size of the bubbles is the average tenure of employees who flowed out from Microsoft to another company. Takeaway here is descriptively these bubbles get larger, right? You see some very senior employees leaving Microsoft and going to Meta, Snap, AWS. Maybe those are not so senior, but Intel direct large competitors. So descriptively in the data you can already see it. Then to get at these causal effects, we use this synthetic controls method. So the key idea here is this f to the -1 is a quantile function. So that just tells you, what's the value of the 10th percentile of tenure. That's probably like 6 months or something, right? 10% of employees have been at the company for 6 months. 90% of employees, 90% of employees for 6 months, and maybe 10% have been there for 5 years. That's what that tells us. This is the quantile function of Microsoft. This is a sum over all control units of their quantile functions, and we try to find a weight for each control unit. Crucially, the weight is one single weight for the entire distribution, right? So this is a distributional method. This is our Frankenstein, essentially. A weighted combination of the distribution of the workforce of other control companies that didn't return to the office. And we try to find weights that optimally replicate the behavior of Microsoft before they return to the office. Then the argument is, after the return to the office, this optimal replication of Microsoft behaves as Microsoft would have in the absence of an RTO. This is all implemented in an R package and hopefully Stata package to come. And then we get sort of these kinds of results. So this is this weight that the distribution receives, and this is the company that receives that weight. And I think our weights make a lot of sense, right? Amazon, Dell, Cisco, Citrix, HP, they all really resemble Microsoft, producers of hardware, computers, and also sometimes software. This is for tenure, then this is for seniority, sort of similar companies, Airbnb comes in there. And the weights are sparse, which is, some companies get a very high weight and then it quickly reduces. That's classical synthetic controls results. And then here are our key results. So on the x-axis in the left panel, we have the quantile, right? So this is the 10th quantile of tenure, meaning people who haven't been at the company very long. This is around the 90th quantile of tenure, people who've been there for very, very long. And then we see that in the pre-periods, we replicate the distribution of Microsoft well, in the sense that all our estimates are not different from 0. So our control units, our Frankenstein distribution behaves like Microsoft distribution. But then in the post-period, we see that for higher quantiles, tenure shortens, meaning longer tenured employees are leaving the company earlier than they would have otherwise. If we discretize this measure of tenure in just a number of years, we see that the effect is concentrated around employees who have been at the company for 3 years or less. So we see a shift towards those employees, and employees who've been there for 3 years or longer than 3 years, we see a reduction in their share in the company. And these results, these magnitudes are quite high, right? So about 3% decrease of employees who've been at the company for longer than 3 years. Looking at our other measure of seniority, we find very similar results. So here, similar to the 0-3 years, we find that the effects are concentrated among trainees, entry-level positions, and managers, we see a shift for Microsoft of around 4% towards those titles. So anything above manager, we see that the share of those employees decreases by about 4%. That's pretty significant, right? Because the mass of employees in Microsoft is manager and senior. So these are our key findings. Then I said we also find that employees leave to larger companies. So what we do here is simply counterfactually what percentage of employees went to startups, so smaller than 50 employees, or larger than 50 employees. And here we measure the same thing in terms of the labor share. So what share of the labor is employed at this company as a share of total industry labor. And we find a large increase in, counterfactual increase in employees going to larger, meaning non-startup companies. Why do we focus on this result? We picked a few dimensions of heterogeneity of interest, and this was one result that came out significant and thought it was interesting. So I think our paper has a simple message. The return to office at Microsoft, SpaceX, and Apple led to a large outflow of senior talent to larger companies that appear to be direct competitors. I think this has a wide range of implications, but I think maybe this room knows more about that than me. Managers often implement these RTOs because they're worried about productivity and knowledge diffusion. But now we see that these employees with a lot of probably high productivity and who have accumulated a lot of firm-specific knowledge leave when an RTO is implemented. So this might counteract those intentions. And there's a large literature on human capital, firm-specific knowledge that speaks to these to our results. And then future research, we think, could focus on how this uneven employee attrition spills over to distributions across companies. And I think there's several papers in this conference that address that. And then there's dynamic and second-order strategic effects, right? Once many companies have returned to office, the outside option becomes worse and worse. So some of our results the effects might diminish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm Pablo, I'm a grad student at Princeton, and I'm going to be presenting work on remote work and child penalties. Probably don't need to motivate much the remote work part. So let's just say there is this large literature showing that when women become mothers, they're disproportionately more likely to permanently leave the labor force, whereas for men, nothing really happens to them when they become fathers. This has been referred to as child penalties, motherhood penalties also in the literature. And there is evidence showing that these are unfortunately largest in Latin America. And in particular in this setting, recent mothers tend to seek higher flexibility by going to part-time jobs, which are often informals, or go to self-employment. So this prompts the question of how does the remote work, and particularly the big change in recent years, has this affected child penalties? So in this paper, what we're going to do is we're going to document changes in work from practice in 4 Latin American countries. We're going to see the Argentine software developers there. And we're going to estimate a pseudo-event study around childbirth. So the data that I'm going to be using is publicly available National Representative Household Surveys in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. In the approximately last 15 years, these are repeated cross-section, which is going to determine the empirical strategy I'm going to use. And we focus on the head of household and its partner, and people who are aged 25 to 45 when they become parents for the first time. And in addition to the employment status, weekly hours, and earnings question, we're also going to be using the fact that these surveys have been asking a question of where do you primarily work? It's not exactly the same in all countries, but it basically asks them that, where they primarily work, and that's going to give us a dummy of whether they work from home or primarily work from home or not, which is ultimately a lower bound on the share of work they spend at home. And 2-digit occupation value from Ding and Iman, yes, which range from 0 to 1. So the main challenge, because these are household surveys, is that we observe parents and we see whether they have a child or not. So we see them, but we don't observe if someone is going to have a child in, say, 2 years from now. So we don't observe negative event periods. And to deal with that, we're going to use pseudo-event studies. We're going to follow the literature here. Basically, the idea is consider someone that became parent of a given age in a given year with certain characteristics. Now, let's take someone who is 1 year younger than this person in the previous calendar year and identical in those characteristics. So these people are identical in observables, in the storm observables, to the parent when it was observed before becoming a parent. And to those people, we imputed them a -1. And we do that for -5 years, basically. And the matching is based on being identical in education level, state, and region, and whether they're single or married. And that being done, let me just say that the pseudo-event studies have been widely used in the child penalty literature, and they yield numerically identical estimates to using a probable event study, and even with greater power because you have more respondents usually. Then we run the regression, the event study. We include age fixed effect, calendar year fixed effect, country fixed effect. This regression is run separately by gender. And the last thing is we rescale the estimates. So we take the event period dummies and we rescale that. So you can interpret it as a percentage decrease or increase. Mainly for hours and earnings, that's usually done, so it makes sense. So first up, we see the increase in remote work practices in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. This is a share of workers who primarily work from home by country. The gray area is 2020. So before 2020 was basically flat up to 2010. If you go back, it's basically flat. Things happen, and then it stabilized in all countries at a level higher than initially. Now the changes are different by country. Let me just say that all these countries say they have some concerns about how the surveys were conducted in 2020. So they all have some ways to correct for sampling and so I wouldn't take all the values at face value. For instance, in Colombia, we see a jump. These are quarterly values. We see a jump from here to here, kind of like in 2021 when the concern are there are less concerns there. But the main point still stands. We see the same increase, persistent increase, as in other developed countries. Oops. Yeah. And basically, who worked from home before 2020? It was mainly self-employed people. Sorry, let me just say the previous figure should include all type of workers. Who worked from home before 2020 was mainly self-employed people, part-time workers, and those who were primarily work from home were doing at the lower paying jobs. And this was equally prevalent by education level. But who works from home now? It's more prevalent among college graduates. The biggest change comes from college graduates. The median wage rate, surprisingly, the gap between the two things stabilizes, decreases, and the gap is basically null. I'm still doing work trying to figure out that. And there is also a large change, mainly in employees. So the event studies or pseudo-event studies look like this. Here on the left, we have the extensive margin response. So the outcome here is whether they are employed or not. We see the blue line is men. Nothing really happens to men as they become fathers. For women, there is a large decrease, which persists around 20%. And even among those that remain employed, the intensive margin response, there is still a intensive margin response of around 10%. This is for the 4 countries in period. And in recent years, the blue line here represents the child penalty in employment based in the year in which they became parents or were observed and were parents. And we see that was around 20% before 2020, and it kind of increased it a bit. But then we will see hours, maybe not great to have 2 green colors. The green one, the dark green, is around 10% and 9% was the same no periods. So when we used as an outcome among those that remain employed, whether they work primarily from or the Dingan-Ehrman value, we see this is highly suggestive. So this is suggestive that women are more likely to switch to primarily work from home after becoming mothers. And this seems to say that men are less likely to primarily work from home, meaning that they're more likely to go back to the office. Yeah, what's interesting here is there's no difference in terms of the hours that these men, there's no difference in terms of the hours they work, their earnings. So yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what's happening there. For women, this includes everyone, so it's also including self-employed people who say they are working from home. So that's something I'm still working on. And for the Dinger and Niemann value, there is a pre-trend differently from the two of them, so we can't really tell much. But when we focus on the hours that they work, so the outcome here is the hours they work. The cut is based for men, women, whether they work primarily from home or not. The green and blue lines are men who are not primarily work from home or primarily work from home. They don't change their hours as they become fathers. For women, actually, those that primarily work from home, which supposedly are, there's a switch. It seems that those that switch to work from home do so for less hours. So this highlights the difference between the extensive and sensitive margin responses. And the last thing I want to show is I'm going to use very briefly the geographic and time variation of remote work and child penalties. So I computed child penalties by state, region, the largest national division, basically in these 4 countries, in period blocks, basically 3 years after COVID, 3 years before 2020, and 3 years before that as well. And I compute the change in the penalty and the change in the remote work or the share of people working primarily from home, and I regress the change penalty on the change in remote work. I'm going to be also using the share of the Dinger and Niemann this as a measure of like work from potential on the baseline. I construct the share of jobs that can be done from home in 2016-19, and I use that as an instrument for the observed change in remote work. Let me just briefly say that I'm going to be doing the child penalty as I described before and percentage times and stuff. In some cases, that might be asking too much data because it's like one state in 3 years. So, and I'm including a bunch of age and calendar years fixed effect. So what I do is a second part is I estimate everything like jointly within countries, so that has like its estimates are more precise. And then the third thing I do is I do a small empirical based correction, which is basically just a fancy way of saying if the estimate is too noisy, then I push that towards the mean in the country, whether if it's like too large or too small and very noisy. So the first stage. Working from potential, the Dinger and Niemann measure is a strong predictor of the share of people working from home. If we see column 2, which is before and after COVID, it's the coefficient is significant. It's a predictor. If we actually run this in the 3 years before COVID and 3 years before that, which is column 1, we don't see anything happening, which is reassuring that there was a shock. And columns 3 and 4 do that, restricting for college graduates. The point estimates are exactly the same, but there's no significance, so yeah. And when we take the regression of child penalties remote work, overall we get a point estimate that goes around -1, saying like a 1 percentage point increase in remote work and the share people remember from reduce penalty by 1 percentage point. Yeah, and for college graduates, the estimates are very noisy. And yeah, this is at the state level. I might be asking too much with 90 observations, so I'm working on trying to get more power out of this, basically, and try to think of this in more like individual level regression. But yeah, all in all, I shown descriptive evidence that there was an increase in remote work in Latin America. I estimate pseudo-advanced around childbirth, and this is suggested evidence that women are more likely to work from home after childbirth. Those who switch end up working less hours. And the regions that saw a larger increase in remote work saw a decrease in child penalties in this period. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's a fantastic paper. You could look at this in other countries, but I thought it was great. The results all make complete sense, and I've seen Henrik Cleven stuff before on the childhood penalty. He, I think, looks at mainly European countries. I thought because of access to data, because basically you need to see both when people are having kids and their income and their employment status, which is quite hard to get, actually. Can you get that in other countries, like the US or Northern Europe or anyone? Is there other places? Because I would guess this would be a global phenomenon. I mean, I agree South America is a great place to look at it, but...
Yeah, so I'm trying to do that as well. I'm basically trying to look at all countries that have a similar question of where do you primarily work? So yeah, those are the 4 of the 8 that I deeply look into.
Do you need IRS data for the US? Is that what you need? Because you need basically whether you deduct for tax for dependent, and you probably need IRS data. So
I don't know if it's possible to observe the remote work status there.
you need to become friends with Raj Chetty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious about trying to get the Brazilian data at the micro level. Like, my understanding is that's more feasible. And I feel like, at least for some of the more provocative things, like men becoming more likely to work in the office when they have kids, it would be nice to be able to do the actual individual level panel.
No, that's true. I guess the main motivation was that in this setting, many women switched to informal jobs, which is not pick up at RISE, the formal like employer and data. But yeah, that's something to look for.
Brazil also has good data on that. So that's like a better reason to go for Brazil.
Sorry,
data on informal work.
Oh yeah, the household survey that is super good. Yeah, we have some work in also in using the panel component of it, but it's more short term.
Great.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. And finally, Simon is up, who's also going to talk about Argentinian remote workers. No, I think not, but...
Of course. Yeah, thank you, everybody, for having me. And thank you for sticking around. Being the last presenter before dinner is both an honor and a challenge. So I'll do my best to keep this insightful and engaging enough to make it worth the wait for dinner. So my project is about the impact of work from home on commercial real estate, on urban office real estate. And it is a work in progress, and I very much appreciate all your feedback. Let's jump straight in with my motivational slide here. So as said before, I think everybody in this room knows that the shift towards work from home is permanent. Latest data from the US is at 28% of full paid days that are currently worked from home. And we see that urban offices, that this has a profound impact on office utilization and vacancies of offices. So we see that office utilization has stabilized at only about 50% of the pre-pandemic levels, while office vacancy rates have nearly doubled. And what is really interesting is not only the trend over time, but also the stabilization over the last 2 years or so. This data is for the US, but this is not a phenomenon that we see in the US alone. We see it in other advanced economies as well. For example, here in Germany. So the trends in Germany are similar, mirror what we see for the US. So we have a stabilization of work from home at about a quarter of employees, and office use is similarly down in the US, and vacancies are also rising. So overall, this points to a profound impact that work from home has had on offices, creating a completely different office landscape. And if we put this in a broader context, work from home reshapes the economic geography of cities and potentially also challenges urban agglomeration effects. And this is something that's really interesting to me to think about, how cities that have long thrived on these urban agglomeration effects and the benefits of highly productive firms and workers being together in central areas, whether work from home not only challenges these agglomeration effects, but might even lead to more dispersion here, or whether it's the complete contrary. So this is what this paper is about, and my research question is now what the impact of work from home and office real estate is at the firm and spatial levels in cities. In the first step, I develop a stylized model, and the stylized model provides a very simple intuition on the interaction between work from home adoption and demand for office space, quality, and location choice. And then since this is mainly an empirical paper, I'm focusing on the empirical analysis, and this leads to some preliminary findings here. So my empirical strategy leverages industry-level work-from-home data and firm-level office lease data in major German cities over time, and I exploit variation in the exposure to the work-from-home shock across industries. And the key findings so far are firstly that higher work-from-home growth from before the pandemic to 2023 is associated with a decrease in office space demand and an increase in office rents and workspace quality. So the first result is probably not surprising, but the latter points to a flight to quality. On average, and this is the second result here, the industry average of 15 percentage points work from home growth goes in line with an estimated 15% reduction in newly leased, in the size of a newly leased office space, and a 3% increase in rent per square meter. And thirdly, and this points to the overall effect on cities, I do not find evidence of a donut effect or something like the dispersion here, but rather the contrary. I find some evidence of a centralization effect. So rent growth is concentrated in the central business districts, where also the vacancy rates increase the least compared to the suburbs and periphery. And I think this has very profound implications for the future of cities in an era of work from home. This project contributes to two strands of the literature. The first being the rapidly expanding body of literature on the economic and societal impacts of work from home. So there are numerous studies, and I cannot list them all here on the slide, documenting comprehensive effects of work from home and why particularly also hybrid work is likely here to stay. And I try to provide novel evidence on the long-term implications of work from home for commercial real estate. And this is also then leading to the second strand of literature, namely literature on work from home and urban real estate markets, where numerous studies have assessed both theoretically and empirically the impact work from home has had on both the housing market, but also the commercial real estate market. What I'm doing here is that I provide some additional evidence on the firm level and spatial link between work from home and office demand. Now, the model is a stylized model. It's not a structural model per se, and in the interest of time, I'll keep this at a very high level. So the model operates through a simple two-step process. In the first step of the model, firms and workers choose their work arrangement. So this is either on-site, it's hybrid, or remote work. And firms maximize productivity, whereas workers maximize utility. In doing so, firms balance the productivity gains of office use and the proximity benefits in urban centers with space costs that are also higher in the centers. Workers, on the other hand, trade off commuting costs against the benefits of being close to the center, such as the amenity value of being in the city center, and network opportunities. In the second step, the firms make a decision about office spaces based on the work arrangements, and this focuses on the size. The maximization focuses on the size, quality, and location. And there are four simple takeaways from the model. So the first key insight is that hybrid work maximizes benefits for both firms and employees. This is well in line with recent evidence from the literature. The second is that hybrid firms downsize the office but upgrade office quality also as an incentive. Think of it as an incentive also for high-skilled workers to return to the office, speaking to some of the previous presentations we've had so far. The third insight is that proximity to the central business district remains valuable for productivity and amenities, and therefore also office demand in the city center stays strong while it declines in suburbs and the periphery. This should be a map, but this projector, I think, is very light. So think of this as a map of Germany with 7 cities being highlighted here. So the scope of the empirical analysis comprises the 7 largest office markets in Germany over a 10-year time period, those being Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Düsseldorf, and Cologne. And for these 7 cities, I have data on more than 40,000 individual office leases with information about the firms and office buildings coming from Colliers, who've provided this data for me. And I additionally have data from Colliers on office utilization and vacancy rates, and combine this with data from the IFO Business Survey, a representative survey among more than 7,700 firms, with data on work from home adoption also over time. And I want to start with some descriptive insights. So if we look at the trends in office leases, we see on the top left panel that work from home growth is associated with downsizing. So maybe just one more methodological point. The circles that you see here represent industry. So this is aggregated at the industry level, and the size of the circle just represents industry size. And we see that in industries with a higher work from home growth, we also see a reduction in office space. We see an increase in office rent, a slight increase in office quality, and a slight reduction in office building age. So work from home firms are going for younger buildings. And what happens in cities is that we see on the left-hand panel here a slight centralization of office locations. So and those firms and those industries where firms have expanded work from home the most, the distance of the office locations to the city center has declined, and in the city center is also where the rent increases are concentrated. Now, the empirical strategy here for this paper is my objective is that I want to identify the impact of work from home on office leases, rents, and location preferences isolated from other factors that affect office demand. And for this, I leverage the industry-level variation in work from home adoption, which is a continuous treatment that was largely predetermined by industry characteristics. I do not have time to show you that in a scatter plot, but you have to believe me for this. And in the methodology, I'm estimating a long diff and diff from 2019 to 2023 to capture the persistent impact of work from home growth on these office outcomes. Now, turning to the results here, I find that work from home growth has a significant and negative impact on the size of the average newly leased individual office space. And it has a significant and positive impact on the rent that is being paid per square meter. The estimates for quality and building age are not significant. If we apply this to the average work from home growth at the industry level of 15 percentage points over this 4-year time period, this is equivalent to 15% downsizing of the average office space and a 3% increase in rents per square meter. And these results are also consistent with findings for the US by Arbit and co-authors. Finally, what does it do to cities? So I'm really interested in the spatial implications and the spatial distribution of office vacancy rates. And what I see in the German context now is that there is a concentration of the vacancies in the suburbs and periphery, whereas the city center is doing comparatively well. So on the left-hand panel, you see that the increases, just descriptively, the vacancy rate changes over the 4-year time period are much higher in the suburbs and periphery than in the central business district. And if I, in the right-hand panel then run a dynamic diff and diff of spatial trends in these vacancy rates, I find that the increase in suburban vacancies are significant relative to the central business district. All right, so to conclude this very speedy, fast presentation, the permanent increase in work from home significantly impacts urban office real estate. The higher industry level work from home growth is associated with lower office demand, so downsizing, higher rents, indicative of a flight to quality. And the spatial impact of work from home points to a centralization rather than a dispersion effect, with vacancies concentrated in suburbs and periphery. Now, since this is a work in progress, I'm currently working on a couple of topics here that I want to do to improve this paper. One of them being the linkage of work from home growth at individual firms from the survey data with the office lease outcomes. I also want to analyze firm level and spatial heterogeneity, as well as the subset of firms moving their offices. And I also want to extend it to supply-side implications and the impact on the valuation of urban amenities. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions either here or over dinner. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That's very exciting. I had a question on essentially the differences that you would think about when you think about European cities versus American in terms of the scales of the cities. And the second is, like, you had Cologne and Dusseldorf, which are very close to each other. That tends to be a trend in Italy as well, that the cities are just sort of next to each other. And so you have another city center there. And the distances that you would take from the CBD would be very different, like if you think of Tokyo, New York versus, you know, Munich, for example.
Right. So thank you very much. Great question. I find this project particularly interesting because it's like the European city structure is just a little different from the American one. We do not have this key distinction between the central business district and residential areas. But interestingly, the results are going in the same direction. Now, going forward, I would really like to leverage more of these differences, particularly when it comes also to urban amenities. So this is kind of on my to-do list, but I think I'm already slightly over time, so I'm really happy to discuss this also over dinner. I don't know if we have time for one more question or wrap it up.
Just one quick question. So I think the most interesting part of your analysis is finding that there's this urban centralization effect in Germany, which is very contrary to what you see in the US with the office market. So one suggestion to try to understand that better, you can look at rent or price gradients in German cities, which will value those urban amenities. So if you find that those cities that have steep gradients, i.e. people really value urban amenities, are also the same cities that have higher centralization effects for the office, that would sort of confirm that there are basically better amenities in Europe, which leave cities more centralized.
Thank you. Great suggestion, definitely on the to-do list.
Great, okay.
Thank you.